Everyone, well, welcome to Page Chewing, part of what Steve and I have dubbed Jam Packed June for Page Chewing, because we have so many amazing interviews with fabulous creatives. And this evening, we have a very special guest, and that guest is Natania Barron, who is a fabulous writer, and I consider she's too modest probably to say, but definitely a social media influencer. And
Oh,
so, Natania, welcome, and we're so honored to have you here.
thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. That's actually the second time today I've been called an influencer, and I don't think I've ever been called one in like once. So I guess I'm going to have to start believing that too.
Yeah, start believing your own hype, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, my one of the questions I have for you, which I've and you have to forgive me, this is a big fanboy moment for me. I
Oh,
had the honor of for my Six Elementals interviews, I got to do a written interview with Natania, and that was like, wow, that was a big highlight for me. But
and you're
now,
such a great interviewer. I mean, your questions are so good, which is wonderful. So it was my pleasure.
oh, well, thank you. I'm honored. I'm honored. But yeah, I'm a fan of you and all you're presenting and your writing. So for those of you, we're definitely going to get into the writing stuff because you're quite an accomplished author and you have quite a few books. Uh,
Mhm.
but one thing I want to delve into a bit for those of you who may not be aware of it is. Um, One of the big things that has made you so popular and so well known is Thread Talk.
Yeah.
So, are you able to tell us a bit about what Thread Talk is?
Yeah, Thread Talk is, they always say that the things that make you or forward your career, you're never really looking for. Um, Amy Poehler has a fantastic quote that says, "You should treat your career like a bad boyfriend because the more that you pursue it, the less that it'll do work for you." Right? Like that's just kind of how these things work, and that's so been the case for me. I've been very lucky in that Twitter, in spite of all its most recent, struggles and conflicts and questionable futures, has been the place where the biggest things of my career have happened. Every single thing from the first book that I sold to my agent to Thread Talk has all happened on Twitter. And I think that for some reason, well, I know why. I have ADHD and Twitter works really well for me. It's kind of like a bit of a valve that I can kind of, lean into. And I actually didn't get my ADHD diagnosis until last year. And Thread Talk was kind of a way for me to work through a lot of the extra research that I do because I do a ton of research. I love going down rabbit holes. And when I was pursuing this diagnosis, I kind of came to this realization that I need to just lean in to the work that I do a little bit more. I grew up being told all the time that I was just too much. I knew too much about too many things. I was too involved. I even had feedback from a boss once that said I was too much of a participant in our team meetings, and I didn't have to talk so much because quote everyone knew I was smart, which is just bizarre, and that's very common. You hear for women who have ADHD because we are often more socialized if we are socialized female and but it's always that extraness that kind of turn people off. And I've always loved fashion from the time I was in third or fourth grade. Historical fashion was something that I just noticed. And I think that I have kind of a natural pattern recognition for how silhouettes change and how literal fabric patterns work. And at the time I was writing this book called Netherford Hall, which is a Regency fantasy. And I was thinking a lot about fabric and really realized there were a lot of terms that I didn't know historically. And at one point, one of the characters is wearing a chintz dress. And I had done a couple of sort of similar threads that had kind of done pretty well. So I decided to kind of, as I was doing my research, to just share what I was discovering about chintz. And one of the remarkable things about fabric history and fashion history is it's steeped in imperialism, it's steeped in colonialism, it's steeped in literally the history of our world as we know it. And you think that researching a floral fabric printed on cotton is going to take you down this sort of loving, like granny's sitting room kind of story. But in truth, it is far more nefarious. There was all kinds of racism involved in it. When it first became popular, people compared it to heathen clothing. Women were attacked for wearing it, and then once initially it was sort of a working class fabric that was used from leftovers from making furniture coverings. And then once rich people decided that it was actually cool to wear, they started banning it for people who were not of a certain class. And then, of course, we know how in India, the fabric culture and how that major impacts of imperialism. And, I sort of said, wow, I think people don't know. There's sort of this, and I think part of it is misogyny, right? We've often in our culture ascribed fashion and changing fashion to the mercurial nature of women, and this is women's work, and it doesn't mean anything, but it means a great deal. And up until the 1950s, men's fashion moved it just as much as women's did, and in many cases, even before that, was the reason that it happened. And so Thread Talk, I came up with a couple of different names, and as I continued to do it, sort of each Monday night or Tuesday night, I would get on and had spent, a few hours that weekend coming up with links and sources and just sharing them with people. And it was incredible how many people just had no idea. Also heartbreaking in some ways that people didn't know certain fabrics belonged to their cultures. I ran into this when I did it on muslin. Muslin has become this fabric of the white gentry of the Regency period, but it belongs to Bangladesh. It belongs to parts of India. The climate, the way that it was made was, built on the Mughal centuries that came up before colonialism there. And to have people say, I never knew this, or my great grandfather told me about it and I thought it wasn't real. But to find out that it was real. And as a fantasy writer, often the things that you make up are less seem more plausible than the things that actually occurred. And I think that's what people discover. And I enjoy it immensely. And now it's turned into everything from primers on various fabric stories and history to commentary on current shows. So kind of looking at how costume designers are choosing to use fashion or not choosing to use fashion, and how that informs the shows that they're doing. And they're usually either fantasy or kind of historical or queer culture phenomenons like Our Flag Means Death. And people appreciate that. And hey, if people are tuning in and it's something that I love to do, you really can't go wrong.
Wow, that's just an incredible. So just for edification, Natania, is Thread Talk part of a hashtag that if I want to find out about Thread Talk, how do I find out about it? Do I go to the website? Is there a link?
Yeah. So on my website, if you go to nataniabarron.com/thread talk, I archive all of them there, because not that I'm super paranoid, but you just never know what happens. And I want to make it clear that all the work that I do, I also save all of my sources. I use Google Keep for each of them, and kind of they all have their own card with all their information. I'd love to do a book at some point. But if you do search the hashtag Thread Talk, you will find most of my conversations about it, as well as, sometimes I do little one-offs or things like that as well. Yep.
Interesting. And, speaking of history, I saw on your website that some of the topics you like to discuss is world building with and without history. So that's if I were to write a book, and I'm not a writer, but if I were to write a book, it would just be repeating something else that's already happened. How do you world build without a reference? How do you do that? What are some tools that you use?
Well, I mean, we can't ever completely divest ourselves from our own history. I mean, we are socialized and we are taught, and there's certain things that we understand. It's why we see so much of the sort of European-centric, white-based, mythologies. And I personally, since I started writing, wanted to either reimagine those broadly or try and start with other influences that go so far back that almost, not that no one owns them, but they're not common, because we always obviously run into things like appropriation. I think my bigger concern is when, and this, the very first panel I ever did at a convention, I happened to be next to the guest of honor, who was a bit old school, and we were on a world building panel, and he told everybody that the best thing you can do is just read about something that actually happened, change the names, and put it in space. And I think I disagreed with him, and that went well. But I think for me, it really encapsulated what I felt was really boring about a lot of things. I often feel like especially then, that I would read I really didn't like science fiction, a lot of that from that period of time, about 10 or 15 years ago, where it did feel so like repetitive. It was the same stories over and over again. And, I love Game of Thrones. And I think that for what it is, George R. R. Martin did a pretty good job. He loves Tudor England. He loves the sort of, Wars of the Roses and these factions. And he pulls from that. But I guess for me, what we think of as history has been incredibly whitewashed, has been incredibly patriarchized, has been romanticized. And I don't need to be the person telling any of those stories anymore. So I like to tell stories from the people that you wouldn't expect, that look and act and perhaps have jobs or experiences that you wouldn't expect. I'm currently writing something with princes in it. And the whole time I'm like, oh, is there a way I cannot have princes in the story? But I seem to have princes in the story. Or if, like I said, if I can't quite get rid of that, I want to try to give the voice to people who are unique. I also think about things like the environment that we're in. I think we often look a lot at history, but not at the natural world. And the natural world, just like talking about Thread Talk, I love plants, and I am a gardener and I'm a hiker. And so I'm always looking for cool things, because really it's what we have access to in the world around us. It always brings me out of a story when someone's like, we're in a world that's totally different and nothing's the same. And they're like, and then they were eating strawberries. And I mean, maybe they have strawberries, maybe that's fine, but so many opportunities for us to do that, and so many ways that the world around you can influence the people that are there. Something I'm working on right now, I decided that has tidal lakes. And we actually do have some tidal lakes here in our world, but it's only a couple inches. But I thought, how cool would it be if the lunar pole was enough that these really huge lakes actually had tides, and then the rivers coming into them had tides as well, because I thought that was really cool. It's little things like that I think make world building outside of our world and history so exciting. And I feel like fantasy, especially, it's in the name. Why go through all the trouble to build something that already exists? You see this with books where misogyny is rampant and racism is rampant. And it's like, those are all important things to note, but I don't want to spend my time rebuilding what's already been done. I want to try to subvert those narratives and change what people see. So even if I'm doing something like an Arthurian retelling, it's going to be vastly different and on a different level than hopefully what people have read before. And food and cheeses. I will add that food and cheese is like my favorite thing as well. Because world building is so much fun when you look at what people eat and how they eat, what their relationship is to the natural world, to animals. Do they think animals are sentient? Are they gifts from a god or a goddess? Do they have to apologize for it? We have such a glut of resources in our current world. Most people do, many people, that I think we lose sight of how desperate so many people were for so many millennia to just get basic food. And if you're writing fantasy, unless you have a magic wizard who can just make food, it's still going to be a challenge. So yeah, there's a lot I could talk forever about it, but yeah.
And wow. when you're creating a world, do you take lots of notes, or do you let the world build as you're writing the book?
I let the world build. I'm a pantser by nature. I like to hold a lot of things in my head and sort of let the characters and the situations and the environments kind of build upon that. Sometimes I'll build more. I've been lucky enough to work with editors who will create story Bibles for me, which is kind of cool to kind of see with your editorial notes, these are all the names that you put, and this is what this means, and this is this kind of plant and that kind of plant. But I just kind of have a bit of a chaotic approach to building those worlds, and some of them kind of, really it's in the editing process where it gets very finalized. I've never gone, at least since I was much younger, all the way to doing like full languages. I'm a character-driven person. As fun as it is to do, I also am a very busy person, and I don't have time to create entire languages. But I do outline to a certain extent, depending on the project, but it's never going to be as detailed as some world builders. I've met friends who have binders that are like this thick, and I kind of envy that. But that's just a little too much of a chaos monster over here.
I do, and please forgive me. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of your work, and I do understand what you're saying about writing something, that's not derivative of some of the things we see in fantasy. And I do understand the element of wanting to create a world where some of our current problems that have plagued us and confounded us for centuries don't exist. I think we definitely need those stories. And I'll be candid. I write from the opposite end. I write about racism, colonialism,
And that's
sexism, homophobia.
right.
It's up front. It's in your face. That's the world that I've created, and there's reasons for that, obviously.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
But I do really appreciate it. It's actually Steve and I, we were on with two other authors, Thomas Howard Riley and it was Mark Timoney.
Yeah.
And Mark Timoney, we were having that discussion, and then Mark Timoney writes from the same way you described, that his world is, where bisexuality is, it's an organic thing. It's not something that's considered to be odd or abnormal or out of place. All these things are just part of the world, and it's not, the issues are not of bigotry towards those kind of things. And it's lovely, it's refreshing to hear and see that. So, but my question is, like you, not certainly as extensive as your education, and not to the same degree. My background is medieval literature and English and history. Yours is somewhat similar. You are somewhat, I believe, of an Arthurian expert. I don't claim to be an expert. I do enjoy the legend. It's near dear to me. But yet there's always been that tug and pull between appreciating and loving, those elements and what the ties are, as you talked about. Having something fresh and inventive, and not being tied to certain cultures, and
right.
Like how do you navigate that? I mean, you can love what you love. You can love something that has issues and challenges.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it for what it is, but still realize the issues and challenges are there. And I know I've struggled with that sometimes. You put out a tweet that it may be very emotional one day, and you had talked about that, about loving this beautiful, these beautiful gowns, and all the embroidery that you talk about with Thread Talk, but yet understanding and appreciating what's tied to that, which you so eloquently described in terms of the colonialism and the appropriation, cultural appropriation, all that. How do you balance that in your head when it comes to your educational background and your expertise there versus
Well, I think about a couple of things, and I know about 10 years ago, I kind of was introduced to this idea of the ideal reader, right? And I don't think I knew who I was writing for until that point. I think I thought, and I met, like many people before me, I was writing stories mostly with white guys that were, saving the day, because that's just, when you're born outside of that, and that's 90% of what I was reading in fantasy. I mean, I love The Lord of the Rings. Like, The Lord of the Rings is the reason that I married my husband. There's so many things in my life that come back to The Lord of the Rings, but I can still look at it and see and say it is incredibly whitewashed to the point that it's kind of ridiculous. There's overt and not so overt racism in terms of, skin color and cultural appropriation, in terms of, looking at societies that look like Middle Eastern societies and things of that nature, and being born bad. But at the same time, I still cry when I watch the series, especially Gandalf's quote to Pippin about, coming through the silver veil to the other side. And, I identified immensely with Pippin when I was young. I read The Lord of the Rings in a time where it wasn't popular. And I just realized I only want to hang out with people who like The Lord of the Rings. Like, it changed my life. But I think it's so important to examine the things that we love, and then to decide as ourselves what our goals are as writers. And really, my ideal reader is myself in probably my late teens and early 20s, who never saw herself. I mean, very early on, certainly we have A Wrinkle in Time. I loved Lloyd Alexander's Pride and Chronicles. Island Wee is amazing. They're very much identified with her, but still the vast majority, and I love Star Wars and all these things, the vast majority of all the big stuff out there, I wasn't there. And then as I came to grips with my own queerness, that became a really important part for me to tell. And personally, as important as it is to have stories where we can solve through it, and same thing with racism, we can work through it. Sometimes, and for me, I wanted to be able to create stories that were a little bit of a breath of fresh air, that, you know, I'm allowed in this space without having to earn trust through this reader and prove that I need to be here. It's like I mentioned a similar thing, you know, Pride Month is this month. It's also my birthday month. So it's always,
happy birthday.
People, thank you. People are always, you know, inevitably someone's like, well, there's all these examples of homosexuality in the natural world. So, you know, it can't be that bad. And it's like, I don't need to be justified in my existence because there are gay penguins. Like, as cute and adorable as they are, and I do love them, and I think it's neat and heartwarming, but I shouldn't have to justify my humanity because people are more comfortable to find examples of them in nature. So that's why, again, I write these stories for me. You know, bisexuality is very important. And the sequel to Queen of None, Queen of Fury, features 2 bisexual characters who have a romance. They happen to be a man and a woman. And I really wanted to make sure that in this story, they both talk about their previous same-sex lovers. But at no point does either of them go, so you're going to be okay with me? You know, like, is this going to work out okay? Or did people disown you? Or was all, because I wanted it to be, you know, something that was relatively, especially with these 2 very dynamic characters, it's not up for debate. This is who they are. And it was fun to write that, but it was funny. A few times I was like, should I have them have the talk? And then I was like, no, I think they know in this story that they are so smitten with each other that it doesn't matter. What I did in those books was a little different, and I think every book and every series that you write will have a different angle on it, because misogyny is rampant. I mean, there's no way to write Arthuriana, I don't think, and still connect it without not having that. And I didn't want in the first book the flavor of revenge to be the woman gets the sword and the shield and beats the crap out of everyone the way that a man would. And that's one way of doing it, and that's not discrediting it. But I wanted to say, what if this is just happening in the shadows and no one realizes it's happening, and that there's power shifts because there is power in being invisible? And that was kind of where that story went. And then the second story is what happens when women don't do as they're told. You know, what happens when you know that what you're doing is in direct opposition to what the king is asking you to do, and he has all power. And that's where queerness in my series is like, it's okay for you to be queer as long as you're going to manage an heir somewhere, right? But really, if you're not able to do that, then people start questioning. And of course, the richer you are, the more in power you are, the less people are going to complain. So it's not that it's not there; it's just not there in the way that I think we're so familiar with. Like, and it's not my story to tell either. I want to make sure that I'm not. Thank gosh, there are so many more coming of stories from people of color and writers of color. And I feel like we're finally getting an understanding that, like, this fantasy belongs to everyone, and it has since the dawn of time. But again, that's not necessarily my story to tell, but I will absolutely share the living crap out of everyone else's stories. I do believe that that's really, really important.
That's fantastic. That's phenomenal. I loved Queen of None. I am a big Arthurian fan, and your book was just phenomenal. It was lovely. I'm so anxious to read Queen of Fury. If I can ask kind of when it's expected out.
Yeah, so December 2022. So it'll be out right before Christmas. We're going through the last edits as we speak. So I had a phenomenal reviewer, someone I met on Twitter, in fact, give me some wonderful feedback. It's a much, much larger book, and it's much more of an adventure. I mean, it's really kind of a there and back again, you know, knight and lady falling in love in spite of the fact that they shouldn't, and kind of reclaiming magic and power was a lot about it too. But also exploring post-traumatic stress disorder, something that with Gawain's character that I always wanted to do. Even in the first book, I knew because the first book is narrated by his mother, Anna, who's the sister of King Arthur, and she's not a reliable narrator. I mean, it's funny because some people don't figure that out at all. And I was like, no, you can't judge every character by her, because she's had all kinds of trauma and she makes a lot of decisions about people, and sort of that's who they are. And the version of Gawain that you see in the first book, she only sees him when he's at his worst. She only goes to him when he's falling apart. You don't know why, and you don't see why, but he's been on the front fighting since he was 15 years old. You know, he saw men die in front of him. He killed men without question. He, you know, has had his uncle wanted him to be the champion, and his body has fallen apart by the time this book, the second book, is out, which is a couple of years after the last one. And it's the big question of, I'm supposed to be this 6'7" brute of a man who everyone knows I can crush every skull and you know, but I can't. My knee won't fix itself anymore. My ribs are in pain all the time. You know, I have horrible nightmares that I can't get rid of. And finding someone that can accept you for who that is, but also him accepting that he is more than a war machine. And I think that that's something that's missing a lot in fantasy, is the cost of war. We love the swords and we love the shields and the big battle scenes, but you know, we've known since the beginning of time that when anyone is involved in that kind of conflict, it changes the way your brain works from a very, very basic level. And trauma is not just it's not just a buzzword from our century. It is a very real, very lived thing. But that also bled into stuff I wanted to talk about Arthuriana and toxic masculinity, which was asking so much of men physically, but not emotionally, and not allowing men to have big feelings outside of violence, right? And so, yeah, those were some ways that I was able to move that in there. But yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell some of the things that I was hoping to explore. But what was more fun about it is that I've always loved like Chrétien de Troyes and a lot of the sort of episodic Arthurian stories. So I was able to take a lot of the places and characters that are in those stories and put them in my book, which is probably the most fun about writing something that's already kind of been done. Is you're like, I'm stuck. Well, remember the one with a lion? Yeah, there was a lion. There was a knight that had a lion. Oh, Van and the lion. And then you kind of go back and read a couple different versions of it. And then you can, oh, he had a witch for a mother. Well, that's awesome. I can write her into the story. And then you have a magic wood and a knight with a lion. And, you know, you get to put your own spin on it.
That's incredible.
And you mentioned a reviewer of yours had some really great feedback. How do you choose reviewers that you look the kind of feedback that you want? How do you choose the people that you ask for reviews or for feedback?
I'm really lucky. This is EJ Dawson, who's actually on Twitter as well. And, you know, she came along, she read Queen of None around the same time you did PL, actually. And she just connected with it and was in love with it. And I wrote this book almost 15 years. I started it almost 15 years ago. So, and I had trunked it for a long time and didn't expect it to kind of resonate with people. And she kept pestering me as she knew that I was working on Queen of Fury, and then said, you know, if you'd like, I would love to be a reader. She's also an editor. She's also a developmental editor. So her reviews were at such a bigger level than most of my readers. I think I'm lucky and I love my readers and they're amazing, but I have to ask them very specific questions. And I use Mary Robinette Kowal's, I think it's 4 questions. You know, what did you like? What didn't you like? What lost you? And what I did not get rid of that like would accidentally, you know, ruin things. You don't want to edit things out that are working. But she, especially with the emotional journey of these characters, had such a laser beam. And I think for the rest of my life that we know each other, I will be reaching out to her. I sent her a bouquet of flowers afterwards because it was this perfect mix of, you know, someone who really understood the first book, but also understood, like, you need a little praise because we writers are fragile creatures, but also where to push for more. You know, like, I need another emotional beat here. I'm not sure what this means for this character. And this really confuses me. Would he be doing this here? And sometimes readers get, you know, lost into, like, you know, what they're wearing or like punctuation. And you're like, no, just don't look at all that stuff. I just need you to focus on the story and the character. So normally I have that option. I have a Patreon now, and that's one of the ways that I get feedback, which is even better because for them, it's fun because they get sneak peeks. But then I do have, a handful of other lovely readers. And I think that's either that they're good and they're going to give you the kind of feedback that will make you a better writer, and you're open to that, because not everyone is ready for that. It is hard to be told something you're doing is not working, and either you rise to that or you ignore it. And then for the people that aren't as focused, who are, I think particularly people who don't write, right? Because some people will see something printed and they feel like this is the final version, but there's so much more that needs to be figured in there. So, getting some ideas of that, I think is the best way, and keeping them on the rails as much as possible and following up. I mean, I'd say about half of the people that you send stuff out to don't get around to it. And it's not personal. It's just, it's a lot. It's a lot to ask for someone, which is why when I got EJ's work back to me, and I was like, are you kidding? You went through 145,000 words of this, and there's not a page that doesn't have a comment on it. And it was mostly great stuff, including like, I will murder you and your family if you do anything bad to this character. So you're hitting the right emotional beats when that happens.
Our friend, booktuber and author Epic Tales had a question. What kind of research did you do to keep the realities of the cost of war authentic? I am currently researching some research from my story.
Well, I guess in a good way, we have a lot of information about that. I think I probably became aware of it mostly when I went into my big Tolkien phase, because a lot of Tolkien's, who I believe, I mean, my son is autistic. I have ADHD. I'm pretty sure that he was part of the spicy neurodiverse people, neurospicies, we call each other. I joke that I turned my maladaptive daydreaming into a writing career, because that's always what I did to be able to manage difficult times. And I had very difficult upbringing with sick parents and, all kinds of challenges, but writing got me through it. And learning about how different people react. You certainly have World War I and World War II. There's a lot of documentation and a lot more scientific understanding of what is happening. But even before then, I did quite a lot of my graduate school work was on the Crusades, and it's not just the work that you see from like the stuff that you hear about the Franks and all, the Crusaders / colonists, but there's so many wonderful primary source sort of observations happening from the folks who are actually the people that lived in Jerusalem. So you have various different groups of Islamic peoples, Middle Eastern peoples, there's Jewish folks, and kind of observing what is happening in war, and how that is sort of impacting their understanding. I mean, they really were like, what the actual hell is happening? Why are these people? And then my favorites are actually the medical observations. So there were doctors living in Jerusalem who were observing what the Europeans were doing to heal themselves. And we're like, why are you drilling a hole in your head? Like, that is not a good, why is that happening? But also looking at their behavior. The other one, I'm like many people, always fascinated with Tudor England. And it was actually learning about, trying to reconcile how horrible Henry VIII was. I mean, he was horrible. His children were horrible. Like we hold them up as this, but he was pretty horrible. One of the theories is that he actually had a traumatic brain injury.
Yes.
That he was, he loved jousting. He was super athletic, but he at one point, multiple times he was knocked unconscious, but once so bad that he was unconscious for 3 straight days. Yeah. And that's the kind of injury we now know because of football players, unfortunately, and many people in sports. His behavior following those things is very closely aligned to what we see. Yeah. Violence toward their spouses, really unpredictable behavior, emotional dysregulation.
CTE.
Yep.
CTE.
Yep. And not an excuse, but kind of a way to understand that. He may have had other things going on as well. We know that he had wounds that wouldn't heal. And that also got me thinking, like, you often didn't die of, like, we see in movies all the time, like slash the sword and he's dead. Might knock you out, might take most of your arm off, but your swords weren't that sharp or agile. So you often died of disease, infection, but the same thing of other diseases, right? If you were a traveling group of people marching on your stomach and you all got something bad to eat, or you all had bad hygiene in terms of where you could put your refuse. Same thing happened in the Civil War. So many of the casualties were not just artillery casualties, but they were casualties. They were people who got sick as well. So I think those were all things that kind of informed that. And then knowing enough about medieval warfare and how brutal and hand-to-hand it was versus the sort of sweeping adventures that we tend to think that they were. That's kind of what pushed me in that department. But always look to primary resources if you can. That's just where you get the unfiltered stories. And the idea of war sickness is not a new thing. And in many, many other cultures, there are discussions of that. So that's where I got my inspiration from.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I know you're a prodigious researcher and meticulous researcher for all things you do. And it's funny when you mentioned I see, Henry VIII, and I think about that. He's such he is a figure of history that, yes, horrible from everything that I've read, but again, also extremely dynamic in a lot of ways. And what happened in terms of, he and the Catholic Church and the creation of Anglicanism and the Anglican Church, Church of England. And it's just, and that when I think about reading about that one fall, they say he took in the joust that set him off on that path that, and also he probably, because of his,
he was probably a dick to begin with, but it didn't really help.
And then of course all of his rather promiscuous may have led to venereal diseases, that potentially syphilis that got him. So and it's just, but the whole thing is just, it's just fascinating. And but when you talk about that, someone who it may have been, as you said, the result of a traumatic brain injury, but like you said, that's never, in all of the more romanticized, as you said, when you talk about historical figures and, especially someone like him, you don't, that's not talked about, right?
No. And I love that kind of forensics. I think it really humanizes, and, part of that is absolutely the fact that the English Empire has wanted, there's a lot of benefit in an empire of creating kind of godlike progenitors, right? These people who were flawless and if anyone is up there in terms of godlike, the Tudors had a stranglehold on the mythology of their own day. I mean, the Tudors weren't even a main, family in contention for the crown. They had to sort of fudge it and figure it out. I guess we could say that he's Welsh, and so maybe they kind of went through there. I love Elizabeth as well, who was also monstrous. I mean, but my favorite story of her is also another great world building thing is, for years they were like, how did, she had smallpox, and then she started wearing the makeup. Was the makeup killing her? She had all these abscesses in her teeth, whatever could that have been? And now the theory is that, they know, because they took meticulous notes. If you ever want to lose a couple of afternoons, you can look at all the notes they took, all the clerks, or the Clarks as it's pronounced in England, who would put the details of every single moment of their days. She ate sugar all the time. They had just started, importing mass amounts of sugar from the New World, and she wanted it in everything. So she ate confections for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And it's not that people had terrible hygiene up until that point. It was more that we didn't have that amount of sugar in our diets. And so now the prevailing thought is her teeth literally rotted out from her face. They didn't know. I mean, sugar tasted amazing, and she had these cooks, still does. She had these cooks in her kitchen who were making her every most amazing thing, dish after dish. And, she kind of wasted away eventually because she couldn't eat. And then likely, I mean, how close your brain is to your teeth if you have a major abscess in there. And I love the story of her deathbed. She walked, she refused to lay down until she finally just collapsed. And that is so her character. So it's things like that we just don't see that side of. And to me, I've always wanted, and that's kind of back to what you're saying, something can be beautiful and sort of, repulsive. And it's that contrast. And I think we are at a loss as a culture when we don't ask questions. And I feel, unfortunately, as an American living in America these days, many people do not ask questions. And they believe in these things that are symbolic without understanding the history behind them. And that, things like gun control, are not a new invention and were not created because, yes, I'm not a big fan of the NRA, but initially the NRA was created to keep guns out of the hands of people who were not white. They were for gun control. In fact, they wanted to keep guns among white men because that was safe. And it's changed over time. But as someone who lives in the South, I grew up in New England, but now I live in the South. I'm amazed at how much I didn't know growing up about how long it lingered and still lingers. The effects of Jim Crow, the effects of segregation. It's not that long ago. And I realized that in school, learning about World War II, and people going, "Oh, it was ancient history." And I'm like, my grandfather fought in it. Like, he's still alive. But we have a habit of moving away from history as if it's just like, oh, it's gone. It has no impact on what we're doing today. No, every step, everything we're experiencing in whatever country you live in is many, many steps forward. And a lot of that, the myths that we create, either support or negate those things. And they're all, to me, just as important as the history, which in some ways becomes its own fantasy itself.
Yeah. Have you always been interested in history, or has it just when you're building your worlds did that spur your interest in it?
No, I've always loved history. I loved school, and I think that the humanities in general were always just so fascinating to me. And I loved science. One of the reasons I was not diagnosed with ADHD because one of my interests is learning. So, no one flagged me as anything odd because I had great grades, but I also got along way more with my teachers. And I think for me, history has always gone hand in hand with literature. When I was in graduate school, you're supposed to pick a discipline, right? Because there's kind of different criticism groups. And I, of course, went to New Historicism, which was this idea that, because I thought, feminist is fine, and the contemporary readings and Derrida's are fine, and Marxists are fine. But I loved this idea of New Historicism, that to get as close as you can to what someone was trying to talk about, you could look at all the other pieces of that world and how that informed it. And one of the best examples I always give is, the wife of Bath in the Canterbury Tales.
Yes.
There's a lot of discussion about beating, like wives being beaten. And there's some great criticism out there that it looks at the ledgers of legal, cases taken up against husbands for beating their wives. And you can see that at the time there was a major problem, more than what was acceptable, even in that time, in that culture. So you're looking at what was actually happening and trying to contrast that to why would Chaucer choose to write such a dynamic female character who's super complicated. Also wrote one of the only Arthurian stories, or told one of the Arthurian stories in the Canterbury Tales.
Yes.
And Chaucer himself was a weirdo. Like, people to this day can't figure out, why he wrote this, how he wrote it, who he really was. Kind of like Shakespeare, we don't have that much information. But history to me is really important. But again, it goes back to those primary sources. Find as many places you can where someone is writing their story down. Someone is telling you what happened, instead of reading a book that's I know some people who are big Civil War buffs, and occasionally I'll pick up, a book and it's someone's opinion about what happened. It's not looking at how people were talking about it. And there's good examples, like people I didn't know till I was here that, people in the mountains here in North Carolina who did not own slaves were conscripted into the Confederate Army. Had no idea. They were the bumpkins of the bumpkins. It doesn't excuse them, but it's a perspective that I did not know, because I was taught, that everyone in the South was, a slave owning. Most of them were really poor. It was a feudal society. Just alongside that, there was a lot more complication than anyone really wants to ask. So the cool thing about history is that it's there and it's constantly unfolding around us. Like, I was one of those people when they unearthed Richard III out of the parking lot. I was just like, I can't believe I'm alive right now. And we're like, we found his skeleton in was it Lincolnshire? It was parking lot. And how, we only have the thigh bone now of William the Conqueror because so many people ransacked it over time. And, I think it just gives us such a light into anything, showing us that people have not changed that much. We may have technology, we may have all these things, but what people care about and what they go to war for and what they write stories about are the same things. So.
And our friend Nathania Robinson had a question. Could you say something more about how writers should incorporate the influence of satirical history into their work? How might they represent different classes, for instance?
So the most important thing to consider about fabric is who is making it, how much time is taking to make it, and how much it costs. Most people do not realize that when you say, oh, they were wearing silk, that silk comes from a certain moth and its cocoons and has to go through a awful process of boiling down and taking out and changing to be able to make into thread. The loom weaving takes time. Velvet is one of the most time-intensive products. So when you talk about people wearing velvet, someone's going to have to make it or figure out how to make it easier, right? And I think that that's more than anything. We just hear people saying, oh, they're wearing cotton. Well, cotton is a very specific crop that only grows in a handful of places. And to be able to do that, you have to essentially create supply chains, and you have to figure out how far are you from this kind of thing. And that's, we call them, they're fiber-based fabrics are made out of plants, which I think you can fake that however you want. You just can create a plant and it happens. I mean, cotton literally makes this little puff that you can pretty much, turn into. But one of the main reasons that thing that kind of blew my mind, I was doing my thread talk on the Romantic period, and I knew about the Trail of Tears and its connection to slavery, and I kind of understood it, but I really did not know the other building block, which was the reason that they wanted that cotton became an industry in the South was because they wanted to get rid of it in India and completely control the supply lines, which then threw India into a horrific famine because there were floods, there were all kinds of things, but also they had been making cotton for so long under imperial rule, they did not know how to make you can't eat cotton, right? you can't live off of it, and the land was just ruined. And so, but the only place that you could grow the cotton in the United States was North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and parts of Kentucky and areas like that. And that's where the heart of slavery was. And that's where they moved out millions of native tribes to make room for enslaved people that they then brought in from Africa. So it's really all connected. And if you're building your world, understand that every kind of fabric means something. I think the easiest way to get around that, if you don't want to do all the sartorial research like me, is to think about colors, right? Colors we completely take for granted that colors on our clothing, the fact that I'm wearing a black shirt and then if I go like this, I don't have like black all over my neck. Black for a long time was very hard to make color fast. The reason that we see so many people in the Tudor period is because they could do it with the Burgundian brown, as it was called, but it was incredibly expensive, incredibly time consuming, and only accessible to a small amount of people. So when you were wearing black, you were showing that you had, access to this. It's all about access to wealth. And certain patterns. Damask is another one, to be able to have a loom with the kind of complexity, which kind of was the prototype for what ended up being jacquard looms and things like that. You need to have the workers, you need to have the understanding, you need to have the materials. You can't just make it out of anything. So you're good, not that you won't have bright colors, because you certainly did have bright colors. They're just not necessarily the colors that you think are going to exist. So yellows and greens and even some magentas and reds, not hard to do for regular folks. There are lots of plants that will give you those colors, but green and like a really, really dye fast green was not until the 19th century with the invention of aniline dyes, which were these chemical dyes, which in some cases, yes, were poisonous. So you could actually get poisoned by your own clothing. But again, it wasn't typically the women wearing the dresses that got sick. It was the servants and the makers who were handling them who would get sick. Because if you're a woman of taste and money, you're not going to wear the same dress many times. And you're going to have layers of petticoats underneath you, protecting you from that outside layer. But if you're the maid, or if you're the weaver, or if you're the dyer, your hands are touching that all the time. And it wasn't until women, upper class white women, started getting sick that they started looking into, maybe it's the dyes that are killing them. Maybe we shouldn't have children's candy have this stuff in it either, because it was also put into that candy as well. And then also my personal thing is embrace patterns. We've had patterns forever. And so many medieval, especially esque fantasies have people in just drab clothing. But people have been embroidering their clothing and adding patterns to their weaving, like plaid. You can put plaid anywhere on the planet at any point, and it's pretty much historically accurate. We have 3,000-year-old mummies in China. We have all the Hallstatt hoard from Switzerland that has, the check patterns. I loved about Wheel of Time. They rocked the plaid. I was like, this is awesome. And that's, even though it's like post history, whatever, still really cool that they use that. So there's usually a lot more freedom than we have. And looking at movies, unfortunately, is usually a bad way of judging how bright and vivid it really was.
Interesting. Yeah. And how do you use colors? Do you ever use colors to represent a character's arc or their journey through the story, like change colors or to have that represent their journey?
I have a little bit. I did that a bit in my first novel, Pilgrim of the Sky. And then certainly I did it more in Queen of Fury because Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is part of the story. And so greens are very important. Greens are important in the first book too. Anna gives Gawain a green belt to wear, and it's sort of a bit of foreshadowing for the future that something's going to happen in that eldritch world, which again, I think is one of those reasons that people thought green was so otherworldly, because it was relatively rare. You couldn't get it that vivid spring green for very long. But yeah, absolutely. And I think what people wear and how many clothes that they wear and, you know, where they go through them is a great way to do it. Someone who does phenomenally is C.L. Polk in their series. The Midnight Bargain was the book, The Midnight Bargain, and so much taffeta, so many different colors. Every character really has their own color scheme, and it's so vivid. I love reading stories like that where you get that extra layer. But I try not to go too far either, because I know it's an interest of mine, and I don't want to get too distracting. I'm a big texture person too. So I like choosing, like right now, the book I'm working on, there's a velvet cloak that's very important. It's kind of worn and it's kind of, you know, seen its time, but it's one of those things that it's a precious item. And that's probably one of those other things that we forget, is that clothing was very precious. And, you know, hope chests were created and filled with fabric because you could wear something and make things of it for your future. And, yeah, that's probably where the depth of where I go. But if I ever got to do something visually and like help with a film adaptation, oh, you bet that I would be all about.
Costume designer.
Oh man, yeah.
Yeah, there's one. I'm sorry, P.L. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Please go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I was going to say I didn't really thought of that until I saw there was a video on YouTube about. I'm not sure if either of you have seen Breaking Bad, but Walter White's journey and the colors that he wears through the seasons. I thought that was really interesting. I didn't even really think of it.
Yeah.
Like that until then. So I thought it was really interesting. And I think in a lot of fantasy books, I think a lot of the times kind of skip over what characters are wearing. And it always kind of bothers me. Like, well, I want to have a visual in my mind of what they look like. And sometimes it's just, he's wearing armor or she's wearing this. And I want to know more about, so I can have it.
You can only have so many robes before you're like, does anyone have anything? Or there's just so many cool things you can take. And look at what people wore. We know so much about what people wore in Rome, you know, because we have all these sculptures and frescoes, and you can look at, Minoan culture, and we can see the colors and everything that were preserved. We have Pompeii, you know, there's so many places that we can look, and it's amazing that people just go, it was blue robes. Actually, I thought Wheel of Time was phenomenal with that. Like the color, I mean, it's probably more than I would choose to do, and I never read the book, so I don't really have that much of an understanding, other than I do know that thread and and that is important to magic. So it made sense to me that especially Moraine's wardrobe is sort of like, it can kind of get beefed up and stripped down. The dress, kind of this blue dress is, you know, there's a walking kind of version, there's her like super fancy version, and then there's the version with like the armor on it. So cool. So very cool. And The Witcher does that too.
Yes, The Witcher definitely does that.
Which is another great one. And then there was one more that I was thinking of that I thought was just really, really cool. It'll come back to me, but yeah, it helps. I mean, it's a language that we speak, right? And I think I've always noticed changing fashions really, really easily, but it's not something that everyone notices, like at all. I think my husband has loved cargo pants forever, and now they're back, but they never left for him, you know. But I can see when things start to change, and it's kind of like I mean, I remember being really young and kind of watching that and being fascinated with what becomes, and that's, you know. That is the biggest double-edged sword with fashion, of course, is that the ones who can afford to have the shoe with the exact same heel that's in season now, and not the knockoff. It's a very different person. The person who is, you know, quirky and thrifty and just wears puts everything together, because you could never quite chase that stuff.
Well, I have to say, you again, as one of my favorite authors. Another one of my favorite authors, I'm not sure if you read her, Tessa Gratton. She, I don't like comparing authors necessarily, but what she does with Shakespeare, you do with Arthurian, and I love
That's cool.
that, but I also want to give readers a chance, perhaps those of you who aren't familiar with your body of work. Can you talk about your other work outside, like Frost and Filigree, like the other stuff that you've written outside of you're reading? I believe you've written some like almost cyberpunk stuff, and like you have quite a broad range of
I do.
genres that you've.
Yeah, I've done, I mean, over the years, I've got a lot of short fiction that's out there. I'm not usually a short fiction writer, but you can find all kinds of stuff that I've done, as well as some game writing. So that was really fun. I've done some games I can't talk about because I'm still under an NDA, but it's really, I got to write in an IP of a video game that I have played, which was really cool because I love video games, especially when you can change the clothes. Big surprise. But my first novel that I published is called Pilgrim of the Sky, and it's best described as kind of American Gods meets Doctor Who. So it's got world traveling, multiple universes, a character who's kind of unknowingly taken from our world into kind of another mirror version of ours. I was inspired by reading about string theory for the first time, which I thought was super cool, that there were like fractal worlds and a little bit romancy, a little bit adventure-y, but it's sort of most of it happens in kind of a steampunk world where it's Boston, but it's not the Boston that we know. It looks like about 100 or 150 years beforehand, but they have different technologies that have kind of taken them. And so it's all about Maddie, who's the main character. And then this idea that there are 8 central godlike beings who are born again and again and again. And they all know each other and they can kind of live as long as they can hold out. It's like they're immortal, but they're not full gods. They're called godlings. And so it's her story in the first book, really about figuring out who she is and kind of deciding where she wants to fit in the world after her boyfriend goes missing and everyone thinks he's dead. And it turns out that it's not quite as easy as all that. And that book came out a little over 10 years ago. We're reissuing it with Falstaff Books. So I was able to make some interesting updates, which was kind of fun to go back and be like, that was an interesting choice there. I'm going to change that. But that's right in advance of its sort of sequel. It's a prequel technically of the next book, which is called Gods of Londinium, which is much more, this one is more American Gods meets the stress of her regard. So it's kind of romantic era, but definitely fantasy, right? So magic exists, and the romantic poets figure into it, which is another interest of mine. Wanted to write sort of that kind of story, and it features one of the characters in the first book named Joss Raddick, who is the godling of the sea. And they're all queer stories. So, I mean, I figured if you're immortal and you live forever and you can be born a man and a woman or anything in between, whenever you want, present however you feel like, that, like deciding on a gender or deciding on your sexuality is kind of ridiculous. But it's a much harder book. It was a book that I wrote both when I lost my great aunt, who was my proto-grandmother, essentially. She was very close to me and a great friend. And then my sister, her best friend, passed away, who I'd known since he was 15. And it's a lot about grief. It's a heavy book. It's a big book. It was modeled after this idea of a coming of age. Like I wanted to write the Bildungsroman, as they call it, of, the godling of the sea, from when he's sort of this nascent creature to who he becomes when you meet him in the first book. And so eventually I'd like to write all 8 characters, each of the 8 god sort of figureheads into a series, but that hasn't happened. But it was really great to finally get Gods of Londinium out there. I'll have both books available in hardcover and in paperback and digital, of course. New cover for the first book. But it was nice. It was nice having that happen. I also have These Marvelous Beasts is a mix of, it's 3 novellas. So it's Frost and Filigree, Time and Temper, and Masks and Malevolence. Actually, it's Time and Temper is the last one. But it's that is more League of Extraordinary Gentlemen with monsters. So monsters who save the world, kind of in an unseen group through the Edwardian period up until the 1930s. And sort of their intertwining love stories. And it's much more adventure, kind of daring do than a lot of the other stuff that I've written. But with some important, that's one where I can talk pretty metaphorically, but also pretty overtly about things like racism, right? If you're a monster, there's a lot of language that is used for people who don't belong to a certain group as monstrous, and kind of navigating the human world, but from a perspective of someone who's lived for hundreds of years. And that was just no end of fun to write. And that was a very important time in my life as a writer, because after my daughter was born, and my first few books came out, I just needed a break. And I had kind of lost, I also was working as a single income earner at a very demanding job that I had no way out of. And I did not have the brain to write anymore. And it was John Hartness, who is the brains behind Falstaff. And he said, I'm opening up this world, and I would love you to write something alternate history. And that's kind of where these came from. And it was about 1.5 years of writing those. And so we put them all together in one big volume. And you can get that. I also have another novella called Wothwood that I think is a sleeper, but people really enjoy it. I joke that it's epic fantasy in a novella size. And it's definitely weird epic fantasy. So there's like a forest made of flesh, and some interesting things, and it intersects with a bunch of other books in the Broken Cities series. So you can kind of read mine, and there's bits of things from other stories as well. But it's about a young chieftain who basically, by not so great means, gets her crown, and then has to deal with what happens when the person she thought she killed isn't dead. And she has to work with him to try to save their entire sacred wood and all that kind of stuff. So I had a really good time writing that one. And then, of course, there is Queen of Fury. I also have a music novel. So I was actually just talking about this with my husband today. So Rock Revival is a book that I wrote. And I love that book. And, but it's hard when you write something out of a genre. I grew up the kid of a musician, and I played multiple instruments and sang. And I really wanted to write a book about the end times of a band, when the band is falling apart and you have all this thing, and people have been in and out of rehab, and fame is kind of falling out of your fingers, and you don't kind of know who you are anymore. And this idea of what media creates you to be versus who you actually are. And especially if you've been in this kind of group with people that you've known since you were young. So, and then it has this whole religious thing as well, because one of the characters becomes a born again Christian, and the main character who's telling the story is very much an ex-evangelical who was traumatized, and kind of her having to come through those things. But I'm trying to record that audiobook this summer. It's been out for a couple of years, but I love doing audiobook narration, and I'm hoping to get the time to be able to do that one. But that's the majority of them. And then I have, obviously, Queen of Fury is coming out, and Netherford Hall is on submission to publishers. So I'm hoping in the next few months to have some good news. And that is the Pride and Prejudice with witches. And it's sapphic, and, but it's sweet. And it was, again, that book came really fast, very furious, and it was just fun. And sometimes I need that. So
it's amazing. I have a feeling Steve's kind of clicking on his TBR now, adding some of your books, because some of those I think are right up his alley. Like, I think he's.
I always hope so.
You know me too well, Fiel.
But and again, I still have to catch up on most of your books. I've only had the privilege of reading, Queen of None, and I believe me, all of your books are on my TBR, and I plan to read all of them.
So many books, so little time. I know.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hard.
But I'm probably going to get to hopefully Queen of Fury first. And
and we'll have advanced reader copies, so I'll be sure to get you one as well.
Oh my gosh, I'd be so honored. Thank you. Oh my gosh, I'm humbled. Thank you. I'd be honored.
It's my pleasure. Trust me.
That's amazing. I do want to know. So when you obviously have an academic background, and,
mm-hmm.
and that's part of who you are, and you obviously, it's something that everything that we are bleeds into our writing as writers, right? And that's one element of who you are, right? What do you think is the most impactful part of your education, your life experience, that seeps into your writing? Like, what about Natania Barron, whether it's perhaps you patterned some characters bits and pieces after you, or what the most about you seeps into your writing?
Well, I think it's two things. I'm very, very lucky in that again, one of the reasons I think I was not diagnosed with ADHD for so long, and it was really until we were in lockdown, and all of my dopamine channels were gone, right? And it was the same old every day, where I really started to unravel and go, I think there's something actually diagnosable about what's going on. And of course, TikTok diagnosed me in like 3 minutes. But I was brought up in a home where, even though we had really difficult times, bankruptcy and disease and illness and mental illness and all kinds of stuff, my parents were incredibly loving and incredibly encouraging to us. My sister and I both were surrounded by art and books. Even though my mom's not a reader at all. My dad's more of a history reader, but there were always books in our house. There were always art supplies. There were always musical instruments. And they were always outside, right? We always lived in a place where you could get outside. My mom's an avid walker and gardener. And so we were kind of given this amazing place to begin, of things that are not expensive that can really change a person for the rest of their lives. And so little things like, I remember reading Perelandra books from C.S. Lewis the first time. My dad just had them on his shelf. Again, not a huge reader, didn't have like a huge library like I do, but the curiosity was there, and they never stopped me from reading things. They probably should have stopped me from reading some things, but they weren't readers, so they didn't know what Stephen King was talking about. But I got into Stephen King, learned a lot of things about how human beings work in dark spaces. But having access to that, even though I definitely struggled socially with friends, but I was able to go from art project to art project to learn. My dad started me on guitar when I was 11 years old, and we always had music in the house, and a piano and drum sets, and we sang together. I didn't realize people didn't just sing with their families until I got older, and I was like, you don't just break out into 4-part harmony. That's not the thing you do. So I think something about that, and something about the way that the ADHD brain is that I built these sort of simultaneous spokes so that I could see the world through a very, very almost 4-dimensional way, right? And arts are so powerful that way. And that's, I fell in love with the Beatles. I started reading, The Lord of the Rings. I got into theater. Theater was so helpful for me because I was actually a really shy kid and didn't really know how to communicate that well. And having a script was awesome, but also being a part of something with other people, creating something. I was in multiple bands in high school and in college, and that connects you to people in lots of different ways. And then, I hope my kids have that. My daughter certainly knows that I'm still the crafting queen. There's no craft that I don't want to learn. I've always wanted to pull things apart. I love to bake. And when I first started learning how to cook, my mom was like, here's the joy of cooking, just do what you want, enjoy yourself. And there was no you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that. Or, they just enjoyed the cookies that I made. The first few batches weren't great, but now I make a mean chocolate chip cookie and all kinds of pastries. And I've had this insatiable desire to understand how things work ever since I was small. And art really is a phenomenal way into that. And you start to see how, the best stories in the world were songs once. You can hear it in the language when you're reading Anglo-Saxon verse, and you're like, well, what kind of instruments did they play? What did they make them out of? Was it catgut, or was it something else they string it with? Was it different than what they used with their bows? How did they make bows? Were there bows at that time, or was it different? And you start to just see the world in this multicultural way. And I think that is probably what I owe the most to, in terms of how I'm able to, back to your earlier question, I can kind of world build in my brain because I can make all these connections very quickly with all the research that I've done forever. I mean, Netscape Navigator was the best thing that ever happened to me in my life, because I could all of a sudden go to Britannica online. Right. And the first early Wikipedia, and, but I remember writing a Western when I was in 14 or so, going to the library and going to the Dewey Decimal System card catalog to find out the encyclopedia that had an entry on Billy the Kid with the one picture that they thought might be him. So now it's just a glut of things. In terms of my education, I think being a medievalist was a really good choice. It is this amazing hinge point in not just European history, but world history. So much is happening. And of course, the Dark Ages is just nonsense, but so much of what is happening now in our world was still happening then. And actually, I was in college during 9/11, and the only teacher that managed to make me feel any bit better than anything was my medieval studies professor, who said, I want to tell you where Islamic extremism came from. We're already learning. It was already a class about the Crusades. And he's like, we have white people to thank for this. And this is what pressure pot happened. This is what the Holy Land was like before the Crusades. This is what it was like afterwards. And learning about different cultures. And, I didn't know anything about people in the Middle East. Like like many people that was not part of the history I was given. But he said, there are many people in parts of the Middle East who can recite to you every single ancestor in their family, all the way back to the one that was murdered by Crusaders in 1110. That is a very different cultural mindset that we have. We don't know. We don't care. Americans are just so like whatever. I mean, and it doesn't matter that we didn't directly. I'm French Canadian, so like my folks.
Oh my gosh, you're what?
I'm French Canadian. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so I'm not too. I'm not too. Yeah, my family's from Quebec and has been there. They were the early colonists in Arcadia and in the Trois-Rivières area. Yeah, so that's where most of my family still is. My mom was not even naturalized when I was born, so I grew up speaking multiple languages, which is super cool. But back to the Crusade stuff. It was so much better to get a view on that through this medieval lens, because it hasn't stopped. It's not like narrative and history just cease to exist because we don't think about them. But other cultures and other parts of cultures are so impactful. And I remember reading about the different Crusades and the Crusaders coming through and just like, you don't look like us, so we're going to kill you. Yeah. But you were killing Christians and Jews and people that had no part in any of this. So, again, our history and our mythology don't exist independently of each other. So getting that view and then having amazing teachers who talked, everything about Julian of Norwich, for example, just a figure that to me was just, you read her approach, this mysticism of Christianity and how she lived in this sort of fever dream of charismatic Christian like fantasy. I mean, just philosophy and learning about Hildegard of Bingen and other characters, and often women who were doing these amazing things. And the first professional writer who made a living as a writer was a woman. Her name was Christine de Pizan, and she had 5 children and she was a widow. And she wrote for the French court, even though she was Italian, and she wrote on heraldry. She wrote books that were masculine books. She also wrote The City of Women. And then you have Boccaccio, who's writing, about all these women sitting together telling stories. And, you realize that, not to mention there are literally knights at the round table who have dark skin, who speak Arabic and who worship Allah. And they're old stories. They're not, it's when people go, oh, this woke version of Star Wars, right? Which is the most recent, like, bullshit. But it's like, I'm sorry, do you mean the woke version of the Arthurian legend that's been around for almost 1,000 years? Because it's been there. People have been in contact with other people. So yeah, it was expensive, and it does not have anything to do with my J job. But in terms of a worldview, I think if you have the right teachers and you have the right coursework and the right look into what the Middle Ages really was about, and it's 1,000 years, so it's not, no short amount of time. It really has shaped how I can see things again in that sort of 4-dimensional route. And yeah,
that's incredible.
Long answer, but
no, and a fantastic answer. So thorough and it's amazing. And that leads me to a question I'm also curious about. I think I had touched on a bit when we'd done our 6 elemental interviews together, and I'm an Arthurian as well. And if you ask me what some of my top 50 books are, Le Morte d'Arthur is still there, and the Once a Future King is still there, and I have a deep fascination with Arthurian legend. Why do you think so many people are completely enamored with specifically Arthurian legend? What's the draw? What makes it something that, all the retellings and all of that, we're always revisiting, this notion of Arthur, this court, and what's the thing that, especially when it ties to fantasy, because there's so many books that are inspired by Arthurian legend.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'll be a little controversial here. I think it's because it doesn't end well. It's one of the few stories that's as much about it falling apart as it is about people coming together. And I think anyone who's lived long enough and been lucky to live long enough realizes that there are seasons of your life, and that people come and go in your life, and that things that you think are immovable and can never be changed can be changed overnight. And there's something about that sort of fascination of watching something fall apart, that, you've got the love triangle, but you also have the fact that it's not just Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot. It's that they each have factions of people that are being forced to choose between folks. I talk a little bit about that in Queen of Fury, because at least the version I went with is that the Orkneys are pulled apart by this. Like, not everyone can support Arthur and not everyone can support Lancelot. And Gawain hates Lancelot, so he's never going to go there. But he also realizes how problematic Arthur is and how much he's done in the name of what he believes is something wonderful. But that kind of power is corruption. No matter how you look at it, you still get corrupted, because you have to start deciding who is worth the time. Who becomes an enemy? Are they an enemy because they just said, I don't want to give you this crown? I don't want to bow before you, even though you believe that you're the right person, has been ordained to do this. The consolidation of power isn't always a good thing. I have some friends who are international, and they're always like, America's just too big. The United States is it's too big, and it shouldn't be that big. And it's kind of like, I see where they're coming from. We have so many different opinions and kind of people backgrounds. Then that was kind of what the Arthurian story is about, trying to unify Britain, right? Even though, ironically, of course, it's like the Frenchest of the French stories.
Yeah, exactly.
William the Conqueror was, Wilhelm le Conquereur, Guillaume, not, but of course, and then in turn, the Normans were descended from, the Vikings, the Norwegians and Scandinavian folk that came down too. So it's many, 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 many layers. But I think people have a fascination. I mean, Breaking Bad is a great example. That show is not going to be happy in the end, but incredibly, in some ways, it is a relief, because, and I'm this way with, like, I do love reading romance and romance fantasy, but I'm always uncomfortable with a happy ending, because it's not going to end well. And you read some series and fantasy and many others where if everything is about these two characters coming together and there's no other story, that doesn't hold anymore. And then I think the internationalism of it is really, if you really are studying it and you really are reading it, many people have a place at that table, or can be imagined into it. And that's one of the things I loved, is that I never felt bad about taking liberties, because that's part of being a writer of Arthuriana. It traveled from country to country. Didn't take that in Italy. No one really knows why. It's interesting. There's a lot of theories, like, why did it? Maybe because Italy was not a kingdom per se. It was this merchant state country rule, and it sort of didn't have that same feeling. But the idea of all these princes and lordlings coming together and pledging themselves and moving forward and to do something great is cool. But it's also, even Merlin's story, the Mary Stuart's books are wonderful. Probably the first real adult Arthur that I read, and it's very sad. It's wonderful and wondrous, but Merlin's story doesn't end well. Most people's don't end well, and I think in that vein, it's actually very similar to Hamlet. The end of Hamlet is one of the most devastating moments in all of English literature, where these characters you've spent 3.5 hours with, literally all of them are dead except one dude. He's like, I am late and something just happened. Poor Horatio. But that in itself is kind of an amazing place to start a story too, right? And that's the other amazing part, is that the Arthurian quote unquote canon is really more of just fractal stories, and they're constantly being influenced. I mean, Star Wars is King Arthur, That's one of the first papers I ever wrote on comparative literature was on Star Wars and King Arthur, because it's right there, beat for beat. We understand that. And what was powerful about the Jedi and what is cool about that story is that for a time they came together to fight a common enemy. You could probably argue though that Darth Vader might actually be King Arthur, but
and I think there's an argument. I think there's an argument there. For sure. Yeah. One of my favorite Arthurian books trilogy was Bernard Cornwell's.
The best. And they're
Where
making a
was it?
show. Did you
Yes,
see
now
it?
it's gone to it's going to be, and that was the first time that I'd read an Arthurian book where they introduced a racialized character. Segrebor
Yes. Yep.
was Numidian.
Yep.
And one of Arthur's right hand guys, and of course I love the twist that they done on making Lancelot a baddie, and so many elements of that. And again,
Nimue is such a fantastic
Yes.
character.
Oh,
Actually,
yes.
one of the reasons that I kind of did my version of her is because I kind of felt like they'd done such an amazing. She's just so crazy and full of character, right? And I love that. Actually, in 2000, my parents, we had a brief time where we decided to do something crazy. We all went to England, right? This was very, very indulgent for a family that did not have the money to do so. But my mom had just gotten through cancer treatment, and we wanted to celebrate. So she let me plan a trip to England, and we met someone. And I said that I was studying medieval English, and he said, "Well, haven't you read Bernard Cornwell?" And I said, "I have no idea who you're talking about." And he's like, "You must." He like literally wrote it on a piece of paper, and I immediately went and bought The Winter King, and love them. So good.
Phenomenal series, Steve. I mean, we give each other recs all the time. I can't recommend that series.
Yeah.
Just as I definitely recommend Queen Nun.
Yeah, and it's the book that they were trying to make with the King Arthur film with Clive Owen. Yeah, they wanted to kind of go with this historical thing, and they failed miserably.
Yeah, it didn't work.
It did not work. It did not work. It did not work at all. Still better than King Arthur: Legend of the Sword, but anyway. It is so neat because Arthur's not a king. Arthur's a warlord. But all those, you see, it's so masterfully done. And, he writes these books that are so tight. Yes. And so the action is so.
Yeah. He's absolutely phenomenal writer. One of my favorite writers. And that particular rendition of and again, a book where, everything falls apart for everybody. And it's depicted that way. And the tragedy, the sense of tragedy and the pathos, it's just it's just phenomenal. So had a profound effect on me and my writing. So but again, your Queen of Nun did as well. I'm sure you can tell by my review. Totally.
Well, you always hope to do something different. And I had discovered Anna in graduate school, and I was like, this is so weird. This is so early that this character is here. And then she goes away. And it bothered me for years. And I was like, I've got to figure out and I was surprised that no one had done it. But again, if I hadn't been doing history, because that's, the beginnings of Arthurian literature and history are very blurred at the time. Yes. I never would have written the book. So, I mean, there's a place for everyone, for sure.
I think that's one of the wonderful things about the Arthurian Legendarium is that you can take these side, what most people could consider obscure or side characters that are basically mentioned, but don't in the most of the canon stuff that you read don't play a prominent role, and you can write a whole series on it, right? And it's just, I think that's I'd like to see more and more of that in literature. What you've done, taking those characters that are lesser known, a bit more obscure, and creating, doing the research. And I know you're a meticulous researcher and doing stories on, because this is so much material.
Yeah.
Endless.
And you get to put Easter eggs and things. And some people have noticed that I've put, if you've read enough, I do like to put it in there. I also, the second book initially was not going to have Gawain's point of view. Initially, it was just going to be Huifar, and it was going to be her story and her kind of redemption arc and her deciding, where she belongs as this like last heir of Avalon and everything. He kept inserting himself in the story, and I was like, fine, I guess you get to be in the story too. But what I was able to play with is that, Gawain is one of those characters that goes from the favored nephew of Arthur who can do no wrong to literally the guy that helps, ruin everything. Yeah. And part of him was like, what if he can be both? Like, what if you can write a story that, depending on how you look at this, he could be the maker or the breaker of these stories. And maybe there are reasons that he was horrible and people didn't like him and things like that. So yeah, there's always something.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of what I think now so many readers, myself included, we love the complexity of in more modern literature where characters have a more fulsome, you see them from more fulsome angles, that most of them are morally gray rather than being good or bad. and that's something that I know Steve is a big grimdark fan, and he's pushing me more and more towards the dark side as I continue to. Even though people have said my writing is grimdark too, and I've kind of accepted what they see in it, because we always talk about the fact that
I mean, I'm a huge fan of Joe Abercrombie.
Yeah,
I read literally everything he writes. I've read, I really like Anna Smith Spark. I like a lot of the folks who are writing, because it is. I mean, talk about Henry VIII again. On one hand, did some incredible things for the right people. If you were in his right circle, he lived a great life. all those monasteries, you had so much money in your pocket. But at the same time, and 100 years before, 50 years before that, reading an English Bible would get you murdered. And the idea of creating a common book of prayer in English, I mean, talk about an enlightened view, even though that was Edward. We know it was also something that was part of the larger plan of the Tudors, but also a monster. And I think that's where morally gray, but ultimately your morally gray characters need to think that they are the heroes, right? Because you can have them. And I think it is important to have characters that have those moments of crisis, but people believe they're doing the right thing and that the cost is worth it, right? That's essentially what it is. The cost might be not worth it to you. You might not make that choice, but people through all of history have done that. We've decided who is human and who is not. We still are asking that question, whose bodies belong to who? Well, that's been something that's been going on for a long time. And as human beings, but again, just because it's fantasy does not mean that you can't explore those things. And I think that that's probably the sad part is, and I mean, I've had this in my own life, people in my own family, they immediately write off fantasy because they think that it's, wizards and swords, and it can be all those things, but it can also be incredibly nuanced views into our own world and deal with the complications of what we deal with on a daily basis. So, yeah.
I think you hopefully enjoy. It's the 25th. I'm not certainly familiar if you're familiar with Michael R. Fletcher. Fantastic grimdark writer. He and Anna Spark Smith will be having them on Page Chewing on the 25th. Cool. So you may want to check that one out.
That's awesome.
We're looking forward to that. So
very cool.
Now we want to respect your time. We know how busy you are. It's been just so phenomenal. We're just so honored to have you. But as we're wrapping up, can you give us your preferred social media platform? That is Twitter, your website where we can get your books and things like that.
Sure, absolutely. So Twitter is my poison of choice. So it's at Natania Barron. It's a good week to follow me. I am actually going to be in Oxford, England this week for work. So I get to be living in a castle for a couple of days. So I am not sad. So I'm actually taking some of my books to do photo. Yeah, I know. Me too. But I actually arrive on my birthday, so it could be a lot worse. But yeah, Natania Barron, at Natania Barron on Twitter. My website is nataniabarron.com. My Patreon is patreon.com/Natania Books. And my TikTok is at Natania Books on TikTok, which is where it's mostly being silly, but also having fun. So, and enjoyed that a lot. And I was just at Con Carolinas last weekend, which was lovely. It was the first convention I'd been at in a long time. I will be at Armadillo Con in Austin in August. So I'm quite excited to be there, and I get to meet some people that I've only known online. But it was wonderful to be asked over there. So I'm looking forward to that as well.
That's amazing. So Steve, just quickly, where can we reach you? International Man of Mystery. Where do we?
I'm not at all that interesting. Best place is here on YouTube or pagechewing.com was our forum, or at Steve Talks Books on Twitter, or I'm also on Vero. Catch me there as well.
Awesome.
And PL Stuart, www.plstuart.com is my website. Learn about the writing, the books. Twitter again is my preferred poison, as Natania said, and that's DM me. You have a question, comment. You want to talk about writing? You want to learn something about my books, etc. Just feel free to reach out. My DMs are always open. I'm on Facebook and Instagram as well, but really, Twitter's where you can find me. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been awesome.
Thanks for coming by, and thanks for taking some time out of your night with us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm going to pick your brain for one question quickly after we go off camera.
I'm here.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us.